13. A brief respite. They'd locked Helen and Chris in the adjoining room, the one Rizzo had so proudly declared had transformed the room they booked into a suite. Baker and the two other guys had frog-marched them into the room once they'd finished up with Chris's ablutions in the bathroom and had thrown a barely adequate first aid kit in after them. The minute the connecting door was closed behind them, Chris had tried the door to the outside. Of course it was locked. Then he tried to open the solitary window only to discover that it had been nailed shut and glazed with toughened safety glass. He'd actually been about to hit it with the bulky old TV set when Helen had stopped him. "They'll come running the first sound they hear," she told him. "And how far do you think we'd get if you managed to smash the window?" And then she killed off any argument Chris may have countered with, "They have a gun, remember?" So instead, they showered together and cleaned themselves up, and for the first time since their vacation had begun to go astray by the motel pool, they'd had some time alone. Helen had taken the time to smear Chris's striped butt with the cool, soothing hydrocortisone cream she dug out of the first aid kit that Baker had so thoughtfully donated. She tested it first on her own ass stripe, and it seemed to be working just fine on Chris. Before attending to her husband's thrashed rump, Helen had bandaged up his freshly circumcised penis after applying a generous dollop of the antiseptic salve that was also to be found in the kit. For herself, Helen had popped a bunch of ibuprofen caplets to dull the ache in her mouth and the twinges from her torn nipple. Upon Helen's close inspection, the stitches Dixie Lee had sewn into Chris's backside appeared to have been expertly executed and had held fast through Chris's bathroom moment. Added to that, the potential painkiller Dixie Lee had given him, the wound there didn't appear to be giving him too much pain. Baker had informed the Sewells upon their incarceration that fun time, his word, not theirs, would recommence upon the sound of the alarm clock Dixie Lee had brought along in that seemingly bottomless bag of hers. He'd made a big deal out of setting the alarm time on the clock for the following morning, and derived great pleasure from informing his captives that when the alarm sounded, their brief respite would be over. He placed the clock close to the door on his side, and Helen and Chris had been able to hear its ominous and imposing tick, tick, tick. Baker had made sure that there would be no escape from the clock's tingy ring when the time came. At first, Helen and Chris had been able to hear the clock ticking through the door. But as Baker's gang's antics had escalated, all they had been able to hear were raucous voices. And by the sound of things, Baker and his cohorts were in the process of getting royally drunk, high, and horny as hell. Bottles clinked, voices were raised, and quickly turned from high-spirited to belligerent. At one point, Helen and Chris had listened with suppressed mirth as they heard Vernon Thuber begging his wife for a blowjob. Ruthie Pegg had then volunteered her services when Dixie Lee had told her husband in no uncertain terms to fuck off and go blow the disgusting little thing himself. It would take one hell of a brave or incredibly foolish man to put anything in that glutton's mouth, Chris had said, and he and Helen had shared a giggle. They lay in the bed in each other's arms, naked and engulfed in the cool sheets, as they watched the night beyond their grubby window turn to a pitch brooding black, punctuated by countless twinkling stars. "I'm sorry for what I said," Chris broke the silence between them. "Before, I mean, about us not being able to conceive." "Me too, baby," Helen murmured, her head snuggled against his chest. "I know that it's not your fault. I was just angry." "I'm not entirely blameless," Chris sighed, "which is why I lashed out at you back there. Sometimes I just feel so damned useless." "You shouldn't." Helen lifted her head to look into her husband's face. "If there's anyone to blame, it has to be me. I'm the one with the ruined insides, remember?" "You need to quit punishing yourself, babe," Chris stroked his wife's hair. "I'm glad that I know how you truly feel now." The exchange Helen and Chris had been forced into at the hands of Baker and Rizzo had been their first real, unreserved talk since discovering their inability to have children. And although one would have thought the circumstances had been less than ideally conducive to such a conversation, it had at least been an honest one, brutally so. "Yeah, likewise," Helen smiled. "It felt good to get it all out. It was cathartic." Chris craned his neck downwards and they shared a tender kiss. "You do realize they are unlikely to let us go, don't you?" Chris broke the kiss. "It had crossed my mind," Helen replied. "I'm trying not to think about that." "I think they're planning to kill us once they've had their fun." "You're probably right, babe. But what can we do?" "Nothing much we can do right now," Chris replied with a tremble in his voice. "I guess we just go along with their games and hope that they get careless before they get bored. If they do, we may have a chance," Chris said, his voice lowered. A coarse, strident laugh, Dixie Lee's, burst through from the adjoining room and made the Sewells jump. "Quit your hogging the pipe, Robbie, and pass me another one of those motherfucking rocks," she cackled. Ribald laughter from Rizzo and the others ensued. Moments later, the unmistakable stench of crystal meth crept beneath the connecting door like a malignant fart. "If there's any way we can get a hold of that gun, or even my hunting knife, we may have more of a chance," Chris whispered. "There are 2 of us and 5 of them, Chris, and you're pretty messed up." Helen kept her voice low. "I'm fine," Chris reassured. "All thanks to you and Nurse Dixie fucking Lee." They shared a laugh, and whilst it was brave, it sounded hollow and somehow inappropriate within the confines of their dusty little room. "I can't see either of us getting the gun off of Baker, though. He holds on to it like it's glued to his hand," Helen said. "True, but he's a guy. And you do have your own weapons of mass distraction, baby." Helen gave Chris a half-hearted smile and pointed at Helen's breasts that were pressed tight against his chest. "You play up to him and his defenses are bound to drop sooner or later, and then, pow!" "Pow? What do you think this is, Batman?" Helen smirked. "And how do we know what they have planned for us? We may not get the chance." "They're guys, and we guys think with our dicks," Chris smiled. "You should have figured that out by now, my love." He gave his wife a fond smile. "So whatever it is they have in store for us, there's bound to be an opportunity to get a hold of that gun. Then let's see how quickly the balance of power shifts." Helen murmured something against Chris's chest that he felt rather than heard, and he realized that his wife was drifting off to sleep. Soon he followed her, and his own sleep was deep and fitful. Chris awoke with a start. Helen roused next to him. They'd not strayed from each other's arms all night. The day's fresh light flooded in through the grimy window and filled their room with warmth. It was beautiful. Yet all the Sewells could focus on was the relentless ringing of the wretched alarm clock on the other side of the connecting door. They looked at each other with anxious faces. Chris extricated himself from his wife's arms and struggled from the bed, wincing with each movement as his body complained. He padded over to the closet and saw that there was a note pinned to the door that had most definitely not been there the night before. "It's from the Rednecks," Chris ripped the note from the door. "They say we're to wear what they've left for us in here." He glanced at the closet with wary eyes. "And they spelled wear incorrectly." Chris screwed up the note and tossed it across the room. "I'm sure those bastards are trying to wind me up." He gave Helen a brave smile, although his nervous, trembling hands betrayed his true feelings. Chris pulled open the closet doors. There were 2 outfits hanging inside. For Helen, a black, shimmering, backless mini-dress that looked incredibly expensive. French, and at least 2 sizes too small. On the other hanger, there hung a pair of red latex underpants along with a collar and leash, presumably for Chris's adornment. Below the hanging item stood a pair of black patent shoes with vertiginous metal heels and the thinnest of shiny leather straps. They looked like bondage for feet, no doubt Robbie Rizzo's contribution to the proceedings. Raucous laughter from the next door arose above the tinny clanging of the alarm clock. It was a scary, illicit, substance-fueled hilarity, most likely at something incredibly inane. "Well, I guess this makes things painfully clear." Helen forced a smile as she picked the dress from the closet. "I'm scared, babe." Chris wrapped his arms around Helen's waist and held her tight, his voice small and weak. "I know, baby," Helen said with a thin smile. "But at least we're in this together." The look of terror in Chris's eyes told her that this was cold comfort. It didn't take either of them long to dress. The alarm had barely had time to run down before they were finished. Once suitably attired, Helen took her husband's hand and squeezed it tight. "It's showtime," she said.